So we'll be starting in a few minutes. We're just waiting for a few people to arrive. I'll just begin by introducing myself. Good evening, everyone. My name is Zani Bok, and I'm the Deputy Dean of Learning and Teaching. I'll be the Program Director today, and it's wonderful to see you all here tonight on this very special occasion. We're just waiting, but in a minute the procession will enter, and I'll ask you all to rise, but we're just going to wait for the procession to be ready. Okay, could everyone please rise for the academic procession? Standing for the singing of the national anthem. It will be sung by a soloist, Ms. Ketumetse Moletsane from the Creative Arts Choir of UWC.
Nkosi sikeleli South Africa.
seated. And I will now call upon Professor Tyrone Pretorius, Rector and Vice-Chancellor, to welcome you all.
Last night was a bit of a disaster, Prof. Waggy. I carry a folder with me in which I have my week's speeches. And so for this week, we have last night's inaugural lecture, tonight's inaugural lecture, and tomorrow night, the honorary degrees. And I had all of those speeches in the one folder. I took out my speech, left my folder on the chair, and started reading and realized I was reading Professor Desiree Lewis. So I had to run back to my folder. But a very good and a warm welcome to our colleagues, our students, our esteemed guests. Welcome as we celebrate the achievements of Prof. Desiree Lewis. Allow me to extend a warm welcome to our deans and our deputy deans, to our acting deputy vice-chancellor, Prof. Pather, and to our registrar, Ms. Dr. Nita Lawton-Misra. I'd also like to very warmly welcome our distinguished inaugural lecturer, her family, friends, significant others that are joining to support her today. It's wonderful to have all of you here on this very special occasion. This evening we continue a time-honored tradition that holds great significance in the life of any university. It's a tradition where inaugural lectures are more than just a personal milestone for an individual. They provide our university community with an opportunity to engage, to hear about what happens in other disciplines, to hear the most topical themes in other fields. This occasion should be a platform for all faculties and all disciplines to be present, so that we can give meaning to what we often say we do, which is transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and interdisciplinary research. For an academic, the inaugural lecture is a profound moment in their careers. It symbolizes the culmination of many years of demanding work in research, teaching, and community engagement. I often feel that it is inappropriately called inaugural because inaugural signifies at the start of something, whereas an inaugural lecture by right should be about the body of knowledge, that the areas of work that shows us what they believe they stand for and what they believe they profess. It is an achievement that reflects their perseverance, their intellectual rigor, and their lasting impact on the academic world. Before we start with the lecture, I would like to hand over to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities to formally introduce Professor Desiree Lewis. Before I do so, let me say, Prof. Lewis, that me and all of us are looking forward with so much anticipation to what we know will be an inspiring inaugural lecture. Congratulations on the significant milestone.
Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm sure you can do better than that. Good evening. Thank you very much. May I say, all professors observed. Born in Cape Town, Desiree Lewis studied at the University of Cape Town, the University of Witwatersrand, and York University in the UK. She received her PhD from UCT in 2000. Her thesis on the South African writer Bessie Head was revised and later published by Africa World Press in the form of a book, and the title of that contribution is Living on a Horizon, Bessie Head and the Politics of Imagining. Lewis believes she was drawn to Bessie Head because she has always felt like a traveler through knowledges rather than a conventional scholar. She feels this kind of traveling was influenced by her father, who worked in a bookstore and enabled her to spend hours after school reading very different kinds of books eclectically. She credits her determination to her mother and aunt, two driven professional women who were definitely ahead of their times. At the back of her mind, and years after their deaths, she still hears them urge, I quote, "But of course, yes, you can do it," close quote. Needless to say, this has not always felt comforting. Lewis' first academic appointment was at UWC English Department in 1993. During her 5 years of employment based in this department, she worked closely with colleagues including Rhoda Kadali, Mickey Flockerman, Mary Minak MacDonald, Christelle Stender, Wendy Woodward, and many others who made time beyond their departmental work to build gender justice and research recognition for feminism at UWC. Collectively, they drove teaching and collaborative activities, which were a precursor to what is today the Women and Gender Studies. This work includes teaching an annual winter schools, seminars, activism, and lobbying for gender justice on campus, and later a postgraduate program for a small cohort of honors and master's students. Lewis went on to teach in the English department at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and then joined the African Gender Institute under the leadership of Amina Mama at the University of Cape Town. Here she was involved in the launch of a journal, Feminist Africa, driving collaborative activities among feminist scholars throughout Africa, sometimes very new for South Africa at the time. She also wrote and coordinated sources for consolidation feminist research from around the continent, with her study of African feminist studies from 1980 to 2002 still being cited from time to time. Lewis returned to UWC in 2006, this time to take up the position in the Women and Gender Studies department. Here, she had the pleasure of working with a small but very dynamic and vibrant group of colleagues who had already begun to transform the Women and Gender Studies program into a fully-fledged department. She sees her work from 2006 with Women and Gender Studies and colleagues and students as both a culmination and continuation of earlier efforts to expand and contextualize feminist studies and research in South Africa. Today, she drives tremendous fulfillment from the fact that many of the department's graduates now teach at various South African universities. She is also deeply gratified by the fact that the department in which she teaches has built up a significant research profile recognized nationally and internationally. Louis' teaching, research, and collaborative research since 1993 has been varied, and over the years, she has acquired recognition both nationally and internationally. At UWC and in South Africa, this has included being, for example, a research fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, a visiting professor at UCT's African Gender Institute, a research fellow at STIAS, which is based at Stellenbosch University, receiving a faculty award for the best edited collection, as well as a UWC Research Award. Being awarded the National Institute for Humanities and Social Science Award for the best nonfiction edited collection in 2021. Internationally, this has entailed being a Fulbright Scholar in residence in Atlanta, the South African coordinator for North-South project titled Globalization and the Body, being principal South African researcher for a South-to-South project on women's knowledge production and digitization with Brazil as well as India. Having the Mary Johart Visiting Chair at Ruhr University in Germany, and being invited to deliver numerous keynote addresses at, for example, New York University, the Berlin Institute for Social Inquiry, and the University of Finland. Louis' publications on feminism and South Africa's visual and literary culture spans decades and continues to be cited by others working in these areas. Google Scholar academics, and obviously the citation identifies her work. In fact, if I can just highlight this, 236 citations for her book chapter, which is titled Representing African Sexualities, 147 for her article, African Feminism, and 179 for her book chapter, African Gender Research and Post-Coloniality. She was also the main editor of the collection of essays surfacing on being Black and feminist in South Africa, the first collection on critical essays by Black women in South Africa, and has also guest or co-guest edited 9 journal special issues. Louis has also been committed to forms of community engagement and struggled her academic and personal interest in heritage, feminism, and the arts. Her work here has included being a board member of the Saji Batman Center and being chair for several years, serving 3 terms on the Council of the National English Literary Museum and being a member of the South African National Galleries Acquisition Committee since 2018. She has also served on several national and international journals, with these including Social Dynamics, Feminist Africa, the Journal of Literary Studies, and Australian Feminist Studies. Louis, of course, designed, supervise, and mentor quite a number of students involved in their development, in their growth, and in capacity development. 3 of her currently registered students, PhD in particular, are likely to graduate between the end of this year and the start of next year, and she has supervised to completion numerous PhDs and MA students. But what she finds even more rewarding is the reciprocal intellectual exchange often achieved with supervising postgraduate students. One of her PhD students who worked with her for many years on women's knowledge and ICT's completed her thesis on feminist digital activism. Another who participated actively in the program on critical food studies has recently completed a PhD on eating cultures at one of South Africa's most popular restaurants, The Spare. Louis' interdisciplinary research trajectory has led her to frequently shifts in subject matter. From 2015, she turned to food studies. This led her to writing a proposal for Mellon funding together with colleagues, Professor Vasu Reddy and Professor Lebo Mlutsane, for a program titled Critical Food Studies, Trans-disciplinary Humanities Approaches. Led by Louis from 2019, this program has supported early and mid-career researchers, supervised postgraduate students, hosted international conference and critical seminars and national events. Now, this project has also driven writing at national and international level, with working with others in guest editing 4 journal special issues and 1 book titled Thinking Through Food in South Africa. The book is in print. All these publications include work by certain funded and mentored postgraduate and researchers. Among the emerging and mid-career UWC researchers and postgraduate benefiting from the program, I can mention just 1 or 2. For example, Dr. Mafofo from linguistics, perhaps she's in the audience. We also have Professor Jidamas from religion and theology, as well as Prof. Oyowe from philosophy. Louis has found working on food so stimulating because human relations to food open up numerous insights into subjectivities, ontologies related to eating and food, and metaphysical ideas about the human and non-human. Vice Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, I present to you Professor Desiree Louis.
Thanks very much, Prof. Khala and the Rector. The title of my lecture is actually, it's going to go up now on the slide. The full title is Food as a Lens in Trans-disciplinary Humanities Research, Rethinking Othering and Being Human. So, yeah, there it is. What I want to do before, I think this is fine. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. What I want to do before the actual lecture is to show you a few clips from a documentary by the filmmaker Shelley Barry, a former student in the arts faculty here at UWC and now a film lecturer at UJ. The extracts are from a documentary called Where We Planted Trees, describing her family's loss of home under the Group Areas Act. But the film also celebrates their resilience. Despite the trauma of their home being taken, they retain a deep sense of connection, not only to fellow human beings, but also to a surrounding environment. So just a glimpse of the film.
Excuse me for what we are about to receive, O Lord. Make us truly thankful for Christ's sake. Amen.
Amen. Why don't we let Dane pray us up? Dane, can you pray for us?
Can we ask the youngest person as well to pray? Dane? Come say something, Dane.
Dane, pray us now. Okay.
Dane, you will pray now. Dankie Vader, voor ons kos, baie dankie, baie dankie. Amen, amen.
We return to the soil, this empty stretch of land with nothing but roads and trees, the taste of gogums and the cry of the hadidas. Our new beginning will grow from this earth. Memory lies in the rubble and the silent trees remember. In the wretched history of our country, we have not lost much. Still, it was our loss, and loss always marks you somewhere. Healing restores the sight of this loss. So before we fade and blend with earth, we have to be the keeper of our stories, to honor those who gave those stories a beginning.
Very brief, but I hope it's tantalizing enough to pique your curiosity. But these extracts highlight some of the central issues I want to raise. Apart from the sociality of eating, one is home as a site of emotional belonging and attachment, another is storytelling, and a third is relationality. In other words, ties of connection and care among human beings and between the human and the non-human. So I'm dividing this lecture into 3 sections, which you can see over there. So to start off with, part 1, the need for restoring. Speaking about current challenges in the humanities, feminist philosopher Rosie Braidotti writes, our current predicament enforces, I actually need to read without my glasses, enforces the necessity to think again and to think harder about the status of human subjectivity and the ethical relations, norms, and values that may be worthy of the complexities of our times. In the last decade or so, I've developed a deepening interest in what Braidotti discusses through work on food. This has followed years of prioritizing power dynamics among human beings, especially by drawing on the nexus of critical race theory, post-colonial studies, and feminism. More recently, exploring the incredible range of work on food as material culture, or food as matter in post-humanism, or food and the Anthropocene, has led me along different but productively challenging paths. What's been especially enriching about working in the Women's and Gender Studies department is a process of unlearning to learn. It's not only our undergraduate students who are urged to unlearn, for example, ideas about the normal body. Many academics restlessly turn to new topics or reassess what they've already done to explore new ways of knowing, often beyond archives that scholars generally use. In my journey through knowledge, I found that focusing on food has led me to neglected, nuanced, or disruptive knowledge making. In her book, Hungry Translations, Richa Nagar urges us to rethink political struggle and hunger. Drawing on years of work with Indian activists, she writes, the common senses handed down to us by dominant frameworks often require us to separate hunger of the belly from hunger of the soul, unemployment from resistance, activism from spirituality, social justice from poetic justice, law from poetry. Put it another way, she reminds us that we usually think about freedom or justice or rights in extremely brittle and abstract ways. Yet what does it mean to feel equality and mutual care? And how are emotions, the senses, and spirituality connected to what we often call for in political struggles? Naga's views are echoed by Sylvia Wynter, who speaks about the neglect of the socio-poetic, even in certain feminist discourses. She emphasizes that political visions or practice are always linked to storytelling, and that humans' existential needs are often conveyed in stories. Wynter reminds us, too, that we live in a globalized world where hegemonic stories hold sway. Stories about triumphant modernity often even limit progressive interventions. Everywhere we still confront progress narratives about the ever-continuing advancement of that Enlightenment notion of the human known as man. And of course, here we see man triumphantly striding towards the future, racialized man, of course. These narratives assume binaristic othering, especially in terms of race, gender, and speciesism. Central elements in the story of modernity's triumph are, and they're listed here on the slide, the development of humanity's collective and rational sovereignty over the Earth's resources, the necessary, inevitable division of labor and social hierarchies, racial and gendered ordering for the efficient expansion of economies. Wynter calls for restoring to replace these narratives that hold us captive. And apart from pursuing this thread in much of the content of my talk, I invoke restoring for this lecture, which should somehow reflect retrospectively on my academic career. So that's really just for noting. I think it's useful to just pay attention to some of these messages. But let me start off with discussing the first novel that I want to deal with. One of the South African novels that's alerted me to restoring through food is J.M. Coetzee's allegorical novel, Waiting for the Barbarians. It's been extensively analyzed, of course, with critics emphasizing its attention to what's generally understood to be colonial, gendered violence and othering. Influenced by this work, I turned to this novel as one of the texts that, as a postgraduate, I honed my post-colonial and feminist critical skills on. Subsequently, much of my teaching and publishing on feminism, literature, and post-coloniality elaborated on this. And for many years, I've been convinced that working on the politics of representation, the colonial and male gaze, subject-object relations, subaltern studies, and so on, were central to thinking about being human, and of course, countering the liberal notion of humanism. Now I believe that the novel speculates more deeply than I previously thought about reimagining the human, outside of the framing narratives we are taught to recognize as the history of human progress. The novel, which doesn't identify any historical or geographical context, portrays members of what's referred to only as empire, typifying human energies from the Neolithic period. In other words, driving agriculture, settling on growing expanses of land, inventing technologies for increasing food surpluses, and so on. As we see from the stereotype of colonial zeal in this slide, members of empire are evolved beings. And I should mention that there's a sense in which I suppose I'm betraying Coetzee's allegorical intent, but I do think that these visuals are useful reminders of what I want to talk about. Members of empire are contrasted with the barbarians, whose backwardness is their hunter-gathering for food, their constant migration, their seeming ignorance of rational ways of amassing food. As the slide signals, these Paleolithic-like groups not only have a rudimentary mode of production, they're also connoted as childlike, unreasonable, stuck in time and place. But the novel also unsettles the familiar narrative of human species evolution. So, territorial expansion, agricultural activity, and surplus accumulation are delinked from civility in the sense of being compassionate and respectful. In fact, empire citizens have a brutally extractivist relationship to the world. We're constantly alerted to their insatiable impulse to increase their sovereignty over land, their fixation with acquiring and storing surplus food, and the numerous references to the granary in the novel are striking. One of the symbolic reminders of their dominance over nature, perceived only as a source for plunder, control, and ownership. This callousness is reflected in the gratuitous killing of animals as sport, as we see in the case of Empire's Colonel Joel. At the start of the novel, Joel mocks the primitivism of a group that eats snakes, and then immediately goes on to boast about the hugeness of the antelope he's killed for recreation. Modes of acquiring food are therefore seen to shape socially sanctioned behavior and ethical values. What are defined as historically advanced societies believe they are entitled to limitless cruelty towards animals and the land, and also towards other human beings. Much of Coetzee's later work is very obviously concerned with the relationship between humans and non-humans. This one, begun in the 1970s, is generally believed to deal with human-centered colonial violence. Yet Coetzee repeatedly emphasizes a continuum of brutality leveled against other human beings and against the earth and animals. This brutality is routine and normalized, as we see in how easily empire citizens respond to the barbarians. Even children are swept up by the impulse to harm and humiliate them. This is made evident when empire citizens gather to witness the defeated barbarians. And there's an extract from the slide that I'd like to read because it is so disturbing. A girl, giggling and hiding her face, is pushed forward by her friends. A soldier puts a cane in her hand, shouts, jokes, obscene advice are hurled at her. She lifts the cane, brings it down smartly on the prisoner's buttocks, drops it, and scuttles to safety to a roar of applause. This is a reminder of how easily groups' narratives can persuade them that the callous domination of other humans and forms of life is their prerogative. As Hannah Arendt reminds us, evil is often not obviously demonic or a deviation from the norm. It is often banal. Restoring is not only found, of course, in clearly defined narratives or literary texts, it can also be embedded in everyday practices and action. And I want to reflect on this in the next section by dealing with interpersonal relationships of care, respect, and connection in what might seem like the very mundane example of women's domestic cooking. Also, in taking this direction, I want to convey that my journey through knowledge over the years has preceded being in the academy. It's involved the fusion and often contestation around memory, prior knowledge, and academic yearning. So, to move on to part 2, restoring women's domestic cooking. Women's domestic cooking has been a source of much critical controversy. Earlier Anglo-American scholarship sees it as the universalized gendered care work prescribed for all women. This advert, promoting women's cooking excellence, is the kind of coercive message that Anglo-American feminism has contested. Critics have challenged the social pressure on women to be angels in the house, as evinced in this very strained-looking woman, being facetiously dubbed Dr. Homemaker. I've held this feminist view for years, the Anglo-American view. Consequently, I've ignored memories that trouble automatically seeing the domestic realm equaling captivity and the public sphere signaling agency and social recognition. But certain scholarship and fiction challenges this view. And this isn't work on modernity's new gender politics or growing evidence of men's roles in domestic cooking. This is work paying serious comparative attention to seemingly traditional contexts. In fact, many transnational contexts during and before the period invoked in that advert that you just saw. I'd like to read parts of a poem as an example. It's by Sipokazi Jonas and is a lyrical tribute to her grandmother's agency as a cook and gardener. It's called Mambele's Harvest. My grandmother was a guardian, tending a kingdom of cabbages, leafy, layered planets. In constant orbit, Emasimini. Umambele was a general, rearing battalions for survival. At 50 cents a head, in imitation of Genesis, she could craft a field into her image long before the sun had sobered to rise. She would midwife a harvest, all Canaan-like, all big-headed paradise-like. This cabbage connoisseur could craft 7 variations of cabbage dishes, and there were revelations between those leaves, chopped fine like sermons. Even now, when it rains, I find that I crave the soil 3 times a day. Some call it anemia, but I know it to be communion. Revisiting my own memories has also taught me much about the complexities of women's cooking. Now I trawl through these in my restoring. One memory involves my mother. Even though she had full-time demanding employment, she cooked meals daily and was passionately committed to making these diverse and tasty. Our home generally had a variety of homemade jams, and we always ate her personally baked pies and cakes, or made from scratch buns and pastry. How she found the time to do this, I have no idea. But both baking and cooking were painstakingly done in her dedicated periods of food-making creativity. Her zeal as a cook included frequent hunts through cookbooks, magazines, and from friends and acquaintances, so that by middle age, she'd acquired a large collection of cookbooks, cooking magazines, as well as her own and others' handwritten recipes. I'm sure that many others, people here today, have memories similar to mine of women who seem to have very little time in between paid and reproductive work, who resolutely found time and energy to cook with care, skill, and inventiveness. While this reveals their agency, household and community responses illustrate how they redefined gender dynamics, whether recounted in poetry, novels, memories, or ethnography. Certain women's culinary skills established their roles as authoritative creators and custodians of taste. We tend to take taste for granted, of course. It's a sense we learn early on and register very frequently. We could therefore see many women's domestic cooking as being epistemological and pedagogical, a way of communicating about understanding sensory pleasures or displeasures, based on what women come to know. Seen in this way, many cooks, despite race, gendered, or class subordination, play influential roles in fashioning tastes within families or wider communities, and also, of course, influencing the other appetites and desires connected to taste. The subject of women's underexplored food literacies kindles many memories of what I grew up seeing around me. Decades ago, I observed how often the women I knew regularly communicated about and through cookbooks or other recipes from different parts of the world. In apartheid South Africa, we most had few opportunities to explore different cultural and sensory contexts. Women's innovative recipe collection and use were conduits to worlds that laws denied them. They were themselves sifting through various gastronomic experiences while also introducing others to new sensory worlds. Paradoxically, limited leisure outside the home or the inability to travel or eat out coexisted with the spirit of adventure and cultural curiosity, and this was often concentrated in homes and the seemingly very uncosmopolitan space of the kitchen. It's clear that in other contexts where groups are socially marginalized, women's adventurous recipe collection can introduce others to new domains of taste, the senses, and cultural difference. And the slide over here gives a sense of the kinds of cookbooks that many South Africans turn to. And I think it needs to be said that, and this is something that Habiba Badroun has also stressed, many of the early cookbooks, white-authored South African cookbooks, drew heavily on the labor and skills and creativity of slaves, domestic workers, or subordinate women that they'd observed. So many of these apparently single-authored texts were in fact collectively authored. The one that I wanted to flag, Indian Delights, was of course very emphatically co-authored by women of Indian descent. And the slide that comes after this is actually a reproduction of my mother's copy. And as you can see, she continued the spirit of collaborative co-writing by handwriting her own recipe on different pages in her copy. The spatial politics of the kitchen are also important in restoring women's statuses in domestic cooking. Anglo-American models insist that domestic and public realms are firmly hierarchized. More recent work on transnational contexts challenges this view of spatiality, gender, and power. I have recollections of this now. I vividly recall many women's unquestioned sovereignty as they instructed and managed others. In certain contexts, then, women's domestic cooking becomes cooperative, involving labor division under the authority of the cook among all in and even beyond the household. This kitchen-concentrated work can affect gendered energies throughout the home and beyond. This takes me to a final consideration of relationality around women's cooking. The domestic cook who shapes taste is also the giver who shares what she produces with others. The food maker's connection to those she feeds extends beyond the occasion of feeding or being fed. Food consumption is therefore connected to networks of interdependence, generosity, and intimacy. With commodity-driven eating out, feeding is separated from the cook's prior attachment to eaters. So the gastronomic knowledge of professional chefs molds taste for paying customers in situations of impersonality or anonymity. So we really do simplify what food and eating mean to human beings when we assume that affect is not connected to real hunger, or that affect is of little importance in considering real hunger. A more productive view recognizes that true hunger-appeasing cooking, feeding, and eating occur in networks of care, responsiveness, and conviviality, the kind of theme that we saw in Shirley Barry's early film at the start. Eating can be separated not only from sustaining intersubjective human relationships, food can also be dislodged from its story of production, of human recreation, and its source in nature. Jacqueline Koch describes the effects of this separation, and I'm quoting her here now. The act of eating illustrates both our direct relationship to nature and often our ignorance of it, because we seldom know where the food we eat comes from. Arguing that nature is not external, separate from the world of people, she draws attention to a dehumanizing alienation that results from not seeing, experiencing, or feeling a connection between food and the conditions of its growth, production, and preparation. I'm now moving on to part 3, which is actually titled Zoe Wickham's October, The Coloniality of Being and Home. Many years ago, Zoe Wickham was a student in UWC's Arts, Humanities faculty, and decades later taught in UWC's English department for several years. In fact, she received an honorary doctorate from UWC 2 years ago. For decades, both her fiction, her non-fictional writing, and her general energy and critical thought have encouraged me and inspired me enormously. Wickham's October, which could be seen to explore what Walter Mignolo calls the coloniality of being, involving the racialized ordering of human beings and knowledge systems, the colonized internalizing of colonial knowledge, and certain groups instrumentalizing of the earth, non-human animals, and plants for their excessive consumption. The central character, Mersha, is a colored woman from a small town in Namaqualand. The novel's setting is post-apartheid South Africa, but the town bears the scars of colonial domination. For example, widespread poverty, unemployment, petty provincialism, alcoholism, social despair resulting from people's denied opportunities. Mersha leaves this home to study and eventually live in Scotland, where she becomes an academic specializing in post-colonial studies. Her life unravels when a Scottish partner leaves her, her brother dies, and she imagines she will have to adopt a nephew. Mersha first leaves Namaqualand because she finds it and the country's laws oppressive. But even when she periodically returns to visit, she still finds it overwhelming. Existentially, however, she's haunted by a desire for home, which she definitely does not feel she has in Scotland. A combined yearning for and revulsion for home is expressed in responses to food. She's either drawn to or repelled by foods she associates with her birthplace. For example, she feels ambiguous about the roosterbrood that Sylvie, her sister-in-law, makes, and links it to painful but also sometimes comforting memories. She's actively repulsed by the tripe and trotters, tomato breedy, and sheep's head that her sister-in-law makes. And her response, which is one of the extracts here, is worth quoting. What is happening to Mersha, the carnivore, here in Kliprand? The smell of meat and onions boiling in her mother's old cast iron pot makes her gag. So she goes to a frangipani tree and wills a remembered fragrance to drive off the smell of sheep's head and trotters. At another stage, in her efforts to imagine home through food, she confuses the bread she knew in her past with a recipe learned from a British cook in Scotland. This confusion is a poignant indication of Mersha's sensory dislocation, her entrapment in a rationality that doesn't allow her to identify, trust, or act on sensory intelligence for feelings of belonging. Mercer's immersed herself in all the appropriate politically correct theory. Since studying in Scotland and living there, she's been determined to embrace a progressive cosmopolitanism. Yet she retains many of the prejudices associated with her middle-class English-speaking upbringing. She's been raised as, in her father's words, a respectable coloured, who despises other Afrikaans-speaking Namaqualanders. And despite her conscious progressiveness, her sensory responses to food, especially food smells, reveal acute anxiety about being culturally and socially contaminated. Mercer fears contagion, unconsciously stereotypes others, and reacts with terror when she identifies certain lingering smells. So her confused or negative food and food smell memories underscore her unbelonging, her lack of attachment to home. The character who does have a positive sensory response to home is Mercer's sister-in-law, Sylvie. And this slide is actually a photograph of a young woman from Lelyfontein who was a poet, who was a photographer, and Wickham fictionalized this character. It's not really relevant, but I find it interesting. Paradoxically, Mercer sees Sylvie as a passive victim and social inferior, uneducated and forced into poorly paid work in the local butchery. Yet Sylvie is not the person that Mercer sees her as. First, we learn that Sylvie is an artist. She acquired a camera at some stage and has taken extraordinary self-portraits. Especially important is that Sylvie is an enthusiastic and inventive cook. She derives great satisfaction from making distinctive meals for others, an act which she sees as somehow sharing some vital part of herself. And as an employee at the local butchery, she's also an excellent sausage maker. And this slide, the extract there conveying Sylvie's approach to a seemingly very lowly work, illustrates her sensory discernment. Something like imagining the trapped taste of time in a culinary creation is something we'd associate with a chef's artistry. And I want to say something more about this. Mercer is often very squeamish about meat eating, although she's not a vegetarian and often cooks and eats meat in Scotland. Her meat aversion only kicks in when she visits Namaqualand and suddenly becomes a class-conscious cosmopolitan fixating on the planet's sustainability. Her outdoor walks with her nephew, when she constantly alerts him to plants and animals, reinforces this facade. Seeing him as a neglected child, she takes it upon herself to teach him about the wonders of nature. Interestingly, when she draws her nephew's attention to a tortoise, he asks if they can eat it. Mercer is, of course, appalled that this young boy perceives a tortoise as potential human food. But the contrast between Mercer, the cosmopolitan environmentalist determined to uplift her nephew, and the provincial meat-eating and sausage-making Sylvie is very complex. Through Mercer, Wickham critiques environmental awareness that doesn't connect colonialism and its legacy, or the big food industry and factory farming, to the morality of torturing animals in contemporary agriculture and the general environmental havoc that this wreaks. Mercer's meat-eating anxiety is therefore performative. It's a sporadic, guilt-ridden lifestyle that doesn't consider how and why meat is eaten under certain conditions and in certain communities. Some recent decolonial work argues, very compellingly, I might add, for context-specific environmental consciousness. In certain societies, meat eating coexists with people's grounding in ontologies of the physical and psychic entanglement of all life. Far from internalizing a belief in being the pinnacle of evolution, people in these societies believe they are powerfully connected to and indebted to other life forms and matter. Sylvie is a quirky example of someone with a strong reverence for and sense of connection to other non-human beings and her environment. Despite her seemingly simple life, she's actively involved in world-making, turning to all available resources to strengthen intersubjective connections that she sharply senses. And a very powerful example of this is her gardening, which is described in the following way. It's on the slide, but I'd like to read it. Here, where she has planted the fehi, she has always known is for her, Sylvie, and her alone. That is why she turned the patch into a garden, arranged the stones. In the veld, she dug up kanidoot and kukumakranka and planted them around to show up the glorious purple. That's not a garden, Jackie sneered, but what does he know? If, as Auntie Ma says, the devil has blown in her blood, then that blood is the screaming purple here at her feet. So Sylvie's resources seem rudimentary, random, even crude. Sausage ingredients, flour, a camera given to her, the drugs and dry sand of a small Namaqualand town. But she uses these to establish a sense of belonging and emotional attachment. A crafted story of belonging is not so much cognitive as intuitive, guided by her senses and an instinct to live passionately, imaginatively, and of course, relationally. And this slide here is just, it's interesting because you can see how she just totally dismisses the old stories as absolutely irrelevant. And it seems like her ultimate assertion of the need for restoring. So where Mersha is constantly trying to deconstruct the old stories in an effort to invent something new, Sylvie is able to dynamically imagine these. So, in conclusion, what's called new materialism and critical posthumanism have been seen as paradigm shifts. In academic canons today, they believe to raise path-breaking ways of decentering the human. Yet celebrated posthumanist academics have been remarkably insensitive to long and varied transnational epistemologies. And it seems to me very myopic for them to present their new knowledge only with reference to traditions in the global north or created in the academy. So I'm in agreement with Juanita Sandberg, who says, I am concerned that posthumanist theory remains within the orbit of Euro-centered ontologies. Why not seek out scholarship rooted in non-dualistic epistemic traditions? Indigenous authors in the Americas, for instance, outline complex knowledge systems wherein animals, plants, and spirits participate and bring worlds into being. Yet I'd also question Sandberg in foregrounding indigenous knowledges as though the stories we can heed are found only in quite remote and inaccessible cosmologies and worldviews. As I've tried to show, many marginalized stories celebrate relationality among human and between the human and the non-human. They may not define themselves as decolonial, as feminist, or even as knowledges, but they are inspiring sources of feeling, knowing, and thought about just, emotionally fulfilling, and spiritually liberating ways of being human. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to sit down or Tammy can sit down.
Tammy, thanks, Desiree, it was great. So, thank you very much, Prof. Lewis, for your very, very interesting talk, which took us into all sorts of a long journey from Namaqualand and elsewhere, food, and food is a topic I'm starting to think about a lot at this point in the evening. But thank you very much, and thank you for your scholarship and for sharing your journey with us. Shall we give her another round of applause? So I now call on Tammy Schaefer, Professor Tammy Schaefer, who's a colleague of Prof. Lewis from the Women's and Gender Studies Department, to respond.
Good evening, and congrats, Prof. Lewis, on this very stretching, very engaging, and indeed timely inaugural lecture. It's really a pleasure to be able to say a few words tonight. It's really wonderful to start with that one of the first of these lectures, which are a return to inaugural lectures, is that of a professor in women's and gender studies. We are a small but extremely productive department in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. And we tend not to celebrate our achievements. And these moments are always so important in that respect. And I have to, at this moment, interrupt my script to acknowledge Prof. Brian O'Connell, who passed away a few days ago, because he was a champion of women's and gender studies. And I felt really emotional passing that picture. And I think that we will be acknowledging a lot, but just to say for women's and gender studies, he was a very important academic leader. It is especially an honor to say a few words in response to a colleague like Desiree, who has long played a role as a lead feminist scholar in South Africa, on the continent, and globally, who has been crafting cutting-edge thinking in feminist scholarship for many decades now. From an early point in the development of feminist research in South Africa, Desiree has been there, always disrupting particular normativities around gender and sexuality, always asking what Gayatri Spivak so beautifully calls the other question. I'm not a critical food studies scholar, so when invited to respond, I was concerned I would not do justice to the work. But what Desiree engages with in this lecture speaks to so many pressing concerns in contemporary higher education, in feminist struggles, and in our troubled current world. I would like to briefly unpack just a few of the key shifts in thinking and living that Desiree's engagements with food gestures to and strengthens. For Desiree, focusing on food is an optics, which, as she has argued tonight, and as we have seen tonight, yields unexpected insights that involve ways of seeing, and I'm citing from Desiree, and analyzing neglected, nebulous, or disruptive knowledge making. I think it is a very rich optics, as is evident in the lecture and in the growing feminist archive around food. Desiree is pointing to the long and strongly argued need to shift our epistemological and ontological approaches to knowledge, both in the academy and in practices of living, which of course include how we eat, how we gather or generate our food, what we eat, and so on. It is increasingly evident that this age of what's been called the Anthropocene or the Manthropocene or the Tutelacene or the Plantinocene from Haraway Singh, where human ways of living dominate the planet, is the source of huge social injustice and growing environmental damage. While the notion of the Anthropocene is of course contested, since not all humans are equally implicated in such extractivist practices, there are few who would deny the damages already done and in progress. As Anat Singh and co-authors write, ghosts remind us that we live in an impossible present, a time of rupture, a world haunted with the threat of extinction. Deep histories tumble in unruly graves that are bulldozed into gardens of progress with a capital P. How much more, then, does the violence of settler colonialism and capitalist expansion give rise to the ghosts of bad death, death out of time? So Desiree's work is similarly located within the current groundswell of dissatisfaction and dis-ease with the colonial, patriarchal logics of capital and the human exceptionalism that underpin it, also hegemonic in the academy. Enlightenment humanism and its promises of development and civilization, inverted commas, have long been shown up as responsible for what Nixon has called the slow violences of post-colonial racist capitalism. And indeed, there are a lot of examples of authors and scholars who, like Desiree, and the authors, creative authors and scholarly authors she shares, are telling the tale of our damaged planet, as Annette Singh has called it, through food, the making and travels of sources of food. Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse is one such rich and disturbing example that comes to mind. Ghosh argues that the dynamics of climate change today are rooted in centuries-old geopolitical order constructed by Western colonialism and global capitalism. At the center of Ghosh's parable is the spice nutmeg that is now very common in all of our homes. Ghosh shows how the history of the nutmeg is one of conquest, subjugation, and exploitation of both human life and the natural environment. Ghosh tells the story of the nutmeg to illustrate the ways human history has always been entangled with earthly materials like spices, tea, sugar cane, opium. Our current environmental and social crisis, he shows, is ultimately the result of a human-centered, mechanistic view of the world and the earth, where nature exists only as a resource for some humans to exploit for our own needs, rather than a force of its own, full of agency and meaning, and entangled with humans and other future survivals. So there is a loud call for alternative ideas of the human, a radical rethinking of what it is to be human. One of the key provocations that speak to an alternative ethico-onto-epistemology, as Karen Barad names this, is the turn to relational ontologies and an ethics of care, both in how we make sense of the world through knowledge and also in how we live our lives. And I think Desiree's lecture is pointing to this so strongly. As Bayo Akomolafe puts it, there is no exterior in a reality that is relationship, entirely relational. Instead of a world with pre-existing actors in relationship with other actors, we are beginning to understand that nothing predates relationship. Such an ontology opens up an imperative of responsibility and, as some of us speak about, responsibility. That is the capacity to respond for the current challenges we are implicated in and all face. Astrid Nemanis, for example, who is well known for her hydrofeminist work, which I draw on a lot, reflects on this relationality and the opportunities such a revisioning opens up. And I cite because I think she puts it so powerfully. Understanding our own human bodies, these sacks of blood, guts, and bone that are mostly made up of water, as bodies of water connected to, coming from, and flowing into other more than human bodies of water, would place us in a different kind of relation to other bodies of water. Nemanis, of course, is using water as the optics for this argument, and I found the way in which Desiree deploys food similarly productive to opening up alternative imaginaries of ways of living and eating that acknowledge relationalities, mutual entanglements, and are guided by this relational ontology. And Desiree puts it so beautifully, and I will cite from her again. What we acquire, see, touch, and consume as food directly alerts us to our connections to other human beings, other animal species, plants, and to the environment. And since food is taken into and therefore also reconstitutes our own bodies, it involves a very visceral experience of embodied relationality. One of the concerns Desiree raises is that many of these arguments are currently being promoted under what is hailed as new thinking, as a paradigm shift, that of post-humanism and new materialism, that is being shaped, unfortunately, by the usual logics of scholarly authority, the recentering of global northern voices. As Desiree rightly points out, this thinking is not new. The entangled binaries of gender, race, class, age, human nature, and so on have long been theorized. The work of Sylvia Winter, drawn on in the lecture, is exemplary in this respect. Decolonial and many strands of feminist thinking have for decades been calling for a disruption of these colonial notions of civilization and development, which are implicated in extinctions of humans, other species, and violences to the planet in general. So in this respect, this lecture draws attention to erased bodies of knowledge, such as indigenous cosmologies and other cosmologies, and the many, as Desiree puts it, unheeded stories that celebrate relationality among humans and between the human and the non-human. Thus, I agree with you, Desiree, that it is oddly myopic to present knowledge about the discovery of connectedness between the human and the non-human only with reference to philosophical and epistemological traditions in the global north. On the other hand, this points to the imperative to appreciate and bolster the rich revival of alternative and indigenous cosmologies and other cosmologies. Much work in local contexts, including in the global south, especially in the global south, that speaks to and revitalizes an alternative ethics of living in relation with and to other humans and more than humans on the planet. We should also work with these many current efforts to re-engage, re-acknowledge, and revitalize these knowledges, no matter what headings they are under. Another key aspect of current shifts that Desiree's work is bound up with is that of the imperative to decolonize the academy, not only its epistemologies and ontologies, but its very methodologies of knowledge. The post-qualitative turn in research and decolonial feminist research is opening up a rich set of alternative praxis in knowledge making and in pedagogical practice, are similarly engaging a range of alternative ways of teaching and learning. Key to these shifts is the turn to embodied, affective, and relational ways of inquiry and teaching and learning. So increasingly, scholars are engaging in mobile methodologies like myself, swimming and walking, place-based, time-mattering methodologies, art-based and creative methodologies, among many novel experimental engagements. And the storing and restoring that Desiree has promoted in her work are very key here too. Both in the classroom, Desiree has promoted, both in the classroom, which is the most radical space of possibility, as Bell Hooks reminds us, and in what we've called research. So I'm particularly inspired by the way in which Desiree has worked with restoring here. She draws on Sylvia Wynter, who argues the value of revisiting the stories that hold us captive, so that the telling of these stories, as Desiree puts it, is fundamental both to people's lives and to bringing about new ways to live. And she notes, human beings hunger not only for physical security and the absence of hunger, of course that, but also for existential freedoms conveyed in stories. Restoring is, importantly, as Desiree argues, also about unlearning. About unlearning the stories we've been told to live by and to do our academics by, and restoring these, that is, telling them differently so that we can begin to live differently. Restoring, of course, is also about telling the stories that are not at the center, those overlooked, erased, and Desiree, thanks for the poignant stories you tell, especially the ones from your own home kitchen, and how you restore these to reshape feminist theory and to acknowledge resistance, such as women's use of recipe books from diverse cultures as, in your words, conduits to worlds that the state denied them, and how food work in kitchens actually reconfigures gendered power dynamics rather than repeats these, and how food consumption is connected to networks of interdependency, generosity, and intimacy. And a range of current work that models such restoring with food is currently surfacing around us in the time since the project began in our university and faculty as well. And I think of Wanalisa Kaba's work on the Iputsoyi, a feminist collective that, in their words, curates space that prioritize Black joy and holds events that center around sharing food and stories that come to mind during the sharing. Also in our faculty, I think of Julia Martin's recent restoring of the inspiring seed work of women farmers in northern KZN, which she argues embodies a radical act of resistance to the capitalist agriculture giants, while serving, also in her words, as a forward-looking preparation for climate resilience. These different restorings of food gesture also to the valuable potential of engaging in more collaborative forums, and hopefully Desiree will continue to play the role she has in opening up ever more capacious spaces to bring together diverse foods restoring, also by way of resisting the siloed and rigidly disciplined university, and to reconceptualize our academic worlds as spaces of sustenance, nurture, and care. I've run out of time, I'm sure. So many thanks again, Desiree, for this brilliant lecture and the much larger, rich body of work that the lecture is built from. And huge congratulations again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Schäfer, for your response and your thoughts. And at this point, I would like to invite our faculty manager, Dr. Sue Makwatz, to come and give Desiree a gift. I think you must come in front. Thank you very much. Last of all, I call upon the chairperson of the Women's and Gender Studies Department, Professor Cesar Ngabaza, who's going to give the vote of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by thanking members of the senior executive for attending, especially Prof. Pretorius, Prof. Patha, the registrar, and all the deans here present. Thank you, Prof. Bock, for coordinating this evening. Prof. Schäfer, we thank you for responding to Prof. Louis' lecture. Perhaps I could steal a second and put both Prof. Louis and you on the spot, just to say, as recipients of the institution's Best Established Researcher Awards, the department is proud to have the two of you call it your academic home. I would also like to thank the Institutional Forum and the faculty, particularly Amanda Philander and Dr. Sue Makwatz, and the entire team behind the scenes for working tirelessly to make this event a success. I witnessed the email exchanges. Thank you so much for all your hard work. Thank you to the members of the academic procession and the guests all here tonight. We thank you for your support. Finally, Prof. Louis, thank you for your thought-provoking lecture and the insights you shared with us. The faculty and the department appreciates your scholarship. And as Prof. Schäfer said, we would love to see it grow some more. Finally, but not least, thank you, Dimpo, for managing the slides as Prof. Louis was presenting. Thank you.
So this brings us to the end of our evening, and I would just like to once again thank everyone who came out here tonight to share this event with us. Thank you, Desiree, again, congratulations. And you'll be pleased to know that refreshments are going to be served outside when we leave. But before then, I'll ask you to stand, and then the academic procession will leave, and then we can follow the academic procession.